My name is John Carr, and I'm Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, sponsor of tonight's conversation. And I want to thank you for coming and braving the traffic and other factors. These salt and light gatherings that we've had, I think we've had 5 or 6 of them. I remember the first one was John Favreau, the Obama speechwriter, and Mike Gerson, the Bush speechwriter, talking about, I think we gave them a fancy title, but what they really talked about was how not to lose your faith in Washington. And it was a very good discussion. We had Cardinal Wuerl answering questions. We had Sister Helen Prejean and Kim Daniels talking about the throwaway culture, journalists who are covering the campaign. And then the last one we had, I hope some of you were here, was about faith, hope, and fear in this complicated, scary time. Tonight we have, I think, a terrific conversation. I know the panelists, most of them, and it really focuses on a really important topic of the role of 2 factors. One is faith in this election, the other is millennials. And it was only a year ago that we had Pope Francis in this city. And I had the privilege of being in the hall when he was talking about civility, he was talking about the common good, he was talking about the poor and vulnerable, he was talking about people with different perspectives working together. It seems a long time ago from then till now. But tonight I think we're going to recover some of those virtues and some of those directions by focusing on the impact of faith in the campaign and the impact of young people in the campaign. Pope Francis, as you know, went to Azerbaijan, I can't pronounce it, much less spell it, or Georgia just this last week. And he has this practice that I find just stunning. When he goes somewhere, when he comes back, he comes out with a microphone and takes questions for 40 minutes or an hour. Imagine a U.S. leader who would simply, take all comers. And one of the questions was about the U.S. election. There was somebody from the New York Times Magazine. He said the U.S. election has gotten a lot of attention in our country and around the world. People of conscience are struggling what to do. What advice do you have for the faithful in America? And, if you're Pope Francis' PR guy, you start going, oh my, what is he going to say? Who am I to vote, Well, what he said was really quite simple. He says, study the proposals well, pray, and choose in conscience, which I think is great advice for us as we face this. And then he talked in a more general way about when politics fails, it might be because the culture of politics fails. If we have candidates that don't reflect who we are and what we believe, maybe the problem is not just the candidates. It might be our problem as well. And so tonight, we have a remarkable group of leaders to talk about that. And I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. Christopher Hale. Chris is the executive director of the Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. He's co-founder of Millennial. If you're not reading Millennial, you're missing something important. I am not a millennial. I read Millennial. It's frankly a lot fresher and more thoughtful than a lot of what I read. Chris thrives at the intersection of faith and politics. And in a city of polarization, he is a bridge builder, which is unusual. All of our folks are. I heard he's been called a radical right-winger and a left-wing apologist for fill in the blank. So he's a columnist in Time magazine, and frankly, he's everywhere else. I mean, I don't know where he finds the time. He worked in the White House. He worked for the Obama campaign. He has a book coming out, Pope Francis, Rebuild God's House, Pope Francis' Challenge to American Catholics. I look back over the last couple days. I was stranded on airplanes. It's not that I don't read your stuff all the time, and in the space of 3 columns, you commended John Boehner and Joe Biden for working together for the common good. You said that the GOP ticket has anti-Catholic problems, and that the Democrats had become an intolerant party. So you have a lot of explaining to do. My favorite one is after the last debate, he had a picture of Bill Clinton going 0. And the caption was, "That's how much we heard about poverty tonight." And that's one of my concerns. Professor Johnson, Georgetown is a big place. I have not really gotten to know Professor Johnson, but I watched him conduct an interview with Jim Wallace of Sojourners during Emancipation Day at Georgetown. And I thought, this is somebody we've got to have as a part of our work. He is Associate Professor of Religion and Government at Georgetown University. He's an affiliate of the Department of African American Studies. He's an affiliate with the Berkeley Center, which is close to our heart, since we work with them closely. He's the author of a great book, Tragic Soul Life, great title, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy. He's working on a new book, and I think you might want to work on the title just a little. The Tragic Soul Life is powerful. We testify with our lives, Black religious radicalism and the ethical turn in politics, which is a challenge to the status quo in African American and politics more broadly understand. He's appeared in a lot of other journals. I'm teaching a seminar for the first time, so when I looked you up, you were on Rate My Professor, and you got really good ratings, and you were a hottie. I am hoping for good ratings. I have no, but we're really glad to have you. One thing I should say, while I don't know Professor Johnson well, I hear more from Chris Hale than I do from all my kids combined, between Facebook and Twitter. And Catherine Lopez does a thing every day, the 10 Catholic things that caught my eye. And it's fabulous. It's on National Review Online. But in a typical Catholic way, it makes me feel guilty, because I can only look at 1 or 2 of the great Catholic things that made her day. She is former editor and the current editor-at-large of National Review Online. She's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. She's been praised for her editorial daring, so I think that means she tells the truth on occasion. She grew up in Manhattan. She worked at the Heritage Foundation. She writes a syndicated column. She writes a lot in the Catholic media, where I come in contact with her. She's been recognized by Feminists for Life. She's been on Vatican Radio. She's known as Kalo on the internet, which is, and I was looking through stuff. She has talked at Harvard and Yale and Ave Maria and Steubenville. I doubt there are many people who can put those 4 together. And one of the things I was reading over the last couple days, she said, we need a new kind of politics. This is why Pope Francis talks so incessantly about mercy, because our politics culture are merciless and are in need of healing. No one can tell you who to vote for, but cynicism, anger, indifference, manipulation, and resignation will simply not do. And I think what that will not do, and that's why we're having this conversation tonight. Please join me in welcoming our panel, which will be moderated by Angela Miller McGraw. Angela has been with us for a year. She's born in Minnesota, great place. Bethel University, it's called now, was college. She worked at Notre Dame. She worked at the University of Pittsburgh. She became a Catholic at Yale. I don't think that happens to everybody who goes to Yale. And she's just been a tremendous asset to us. And the particular thing she focuses on is our outreach to young leaders in public life through Salt and Light Gathering like tonight and through our Latino Leadership Initiative. So please join me in welcoming our panel and Angela.
Thanks, John. I think we can all agree that no one gives an introduction like John. It's always engaging. So thank you for coming tonight. It's exciting to see some of you. I've seen you before, see new faces. As John said, tonight we're going to be talking about the impact of religion and the role of millennials on this campaign. And so I'm going to open up to the panel right away to ask the question of how have these and other factors influenced where we find ourselves today, the particular candidates, the tenor of the campaign. What would you say have been the main reasons why, when you look at millennials, when you look at the role of religion, when you look at how faith and these broader conversations around public policy have influenced the candidates that we see before us?
I'll jump in. First of all, I'm very grateful to be here. Everything that you guys are doing is part of the solution from my observer point of view. I always meet new people when I come to these events, and that's what we've got to do more of. Pope Francis warns about ideological colonization, and you see it in Washington on steroids, right? Where everyone hangs out with the same people and talks to the same people, and they all agree with one another. And the encouraging thing I find about this election, is I always have to find something encouraging to remind me of hope, and is the fact that it's been so liberating, right? You finally are at the point where if you would fall into line once the nominee came, you would just follow the party line, and Catholics aren't doing that this time. One of the most encouraging things I've done in the last couple of months is I fled the country for the political conventions, which is sort of like unheard of. I work at National Review magazine. I'm sort of supposed to pay attention to these things, but the Pope was going to World Youth Day in Poland. And whereas at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast in May, I had sort of this rude awakening moment where it's at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I hadn't had my coffee yet, and I'm on the escalator, and someone says to me, "Well, you have to vote for Trump, right?" And I'm like, wait a second, it's May. Like, what kind of cheap dates are we? You know, we're having this conversation in May. You know, but then I went to World Youth Day, and what I found instead was, you know, in sort of Washington circles, I hear a lot of like justification for why you're going to line up behind one candidate and another, but at World Youth Day, young people got it. They're the most encouraging thing and the huge opportunity I think this election represents is a pox on both your houses. Let's be honest about this. No party should, first of all, take for granted they have the Catholic vote. No Catholic should think of themselves as a member of a political party before they think of themselves as Catholics. And millennials, I mean, the refreshing thing about millennials is, in one hand, somebody was reading me poll numbers and doing some poll background downloading sort of on the phone the other day, and they said, millennials don't care about any of the stuff about the Clintons in the 90s because they weren't around for it, right? But the good part about that is millennials don't have the hang-ups that older people have. If we're talking about a Catholic Church context, for instance, the Second Vatican Council and all these divisions, and it's boring to millennials. And now you could argue that we should be better students of history, but this is the opportunity it presents, right? You're free of the hang-ups. And so it's a real opportunity to start crafting, okay, what should Catholic politics look like? How there's a problem where at every election cycle, a lot of Catholics have to look and say, I can't vote for this party because of abortion. That should not be. Archbishop Chaput from Philadelphia put it best during an interview about, I think it was 8 years ago, around election time. And he said, if you had told me 4 decades ago, that the Democratic Party would become the party protecting legal abortion, I wouldn't have believed you because there were too many Catholics in it. The fact of the matter is, Catholics in political parties, in politics, need to be Catholics first and really need to expect more from our politics. And I do believe that the candidates and politics, the way it is today, is an indictment of Catholics not being Catholic in the public square.
It's really interesting. I don't generally talk in public settings about religion or politics. Kind of the traditional professor. You write your books, try to get tenure, and stay out of politics. But it's interesting. I mean, this cycle, I find that a great deal of despair, and in many respects, this despair that I see in terms of whatever the general public is, I actually see in the classroom, and I think. What's pretty striking is that even though one might argue millennials don't have some of the hang-ups, I find that there's this over-concern with their future, and that fear of their future, I think, forces people to sort of cling to what is familiar, and people are really hesitant to actually raise a critical sort of opinion, in part because they don't want to be ostracized, or there's a sense in which some people actually feel silenced, and particularly like a lot of my white male students, so they feel a certain kind of silencing. So my fear is that I'm not sure this election is doing anything to try to figure out how do we allow the range of voices to actually have a space in public life, and to recognize that as you bring in more people to the public will actually become reconfigured. And I think part of my concern is that even as we talk about bringing in a range of voices, whether it's religious voices or from different ethnic groups, my fear is that we want to keep the public looking the same way. And people can talk as long as we don't really readjust the square. And my sense is that this election really is speaking to this idea we have to change what the square looks like. And I think it's pretty sort of, horrific that we've just now recognizing that there are people who are uneducated, without a college degree, who feel very sort of frustrated. And my sense is that, regular people know this is the reality, but for some reason, the people who sit, in powerful positions sort of ignore this. If you only read the New York Times, then I think this whole idea of what's happening in our country is somewhat novel. But I think if people who are actually living kind of ordinary lives recognize that we've had some major issues. And my fear is that I don't think the candidates are addressing. I think one candidate is trying to get elected, and the other one is simply trying to, show power and prowess, in the public sphere. And so my fear is that I'm not sure. I don't know how we get to the voices that are actually pushing these candidates. I think right now people are making a parody of them, but I'm not sure we're actually allowing those voices to actually creep up. And whether it's Black Lives Matter or the sort of ambiguous steel worker in Pittsburgh or in Ohio, these people really don't have a voice. And that's, I think, the biggest sort of downfall of the election. And in many respects, I keep thinking of the Reconstruction period, where this was a moment where African Americans and working class whites had an opportunity to actually form coalitions. And for all kinds of reasons, it just didn't happen. And people allowed fear to kind of take over. And my sense is that there's a lot of fear driving this election. And I'm not sure I've read enough, or I'm not sure I'm convinced that our leaders recognize the degree of this fear. That's not like a pessimist, but I am very concerned.
E.J. Dionne says about the Catholic vote, and I think this is well articulated, that it is the most important demographic and it doesn't exist. And I think that well describes the millennial vote in the 2016 election. If you self-identify as a socialist and you are a millennial in the United States, the latest polling says your number one candidate, Gary Johnson. Millennials' opinions on politics don't make sense. I think it's just about out makes that's just the honest articulation of it. I am 27, born in '89. That actually puts me right in the middle of the millennial demographic. I will not vote for a white male for president of the United States before my 31st birthday, and if I have it my way, before my 35th birthday. So I think there's a new reality that exists. However, I am a white male. And I do, if I honestly look at myself, I do find the realities of privilege and the fear of not having said privilege in the future. And I think that these complicating realities really play out among millennials. And the millennial choice for 2016, unfortunately, in my opinion, is none of the above. Look, in the 2016 primary, GOP millennial participation was at the lowest level in 30 years. If they did vote, they were insiders, and they voted for Jeb Bush, or they voted for Marco Rubio. Millennial participation in the 2016 Democratic primary was lower than it's been in 25 years, and they voted for Bernie Sanders. The choices that exist in the fall were not the millennials' choices. And quite honestly, if you really look at it, the millennials' choices weren't even running. And I think from a Catholic construct, I spend all day, I get paid to be a blowhard and tell my opinion and spout it out. When in 2014, I was so confident, we had 16 Catholics who were running for president of the United States, if you remember, back in the day. And I went out on TV and said, this is going to be the most Catholic presidential election ever. A year ago, when Pope Francis came to the United States, there was a sense that perhaps I was off on that. There was the Trump surprise that existed. But I remember the biggest miracle of Pope Francis's visit to the United States last year was for an entire week, Donald Trump was not on television. And to me, that was his greatest miracle, and maybe a cause for canonization when he dies. I thought that perhaps he was going to change the narrative. I just went on BBC today because we were talking about Pope Francis' remarks. I think we've gone from the most Catholic presidential election to the least Catholic presidential election. I think, to be honest, we can critique this later. I think it's a good conversation to have. I think we lost. I think Catholics in the United States, no matter what the election is on November 8th, I think we lost. The parties are the values that we hold dear on the dignity of life and work and the common good are on the back burners. And the politics of inclusion, which I think is at the heart of the social mission of the Catholic Church, doesn't exist. What's really intriguing, and I'll finish because I'm talking too much, I worked on the 2012 campaign, and there was 3 things we learned about Catholic voters. This is polling we did. It's really intriguing because we also found that what is similar about Catholic voters in the United States, millennials are the same. There's 3 things. Number 1, they are more likely to consume politics than the public at large. Millennials are more likely than baby boomers to consume politics and media, et cetera. And Catholics are as well. Catholics are actually about 6 or 7% more likely to vote in elections. The second thing is they're never MVPs in their party. They're always, if you will, heretics or apostates. They're apostate Democrats, apostate Republicans. And young people, a lot of people think this is a negative thing, actually do not participate in party politics and dislike party politics. And the third thing I think is so interesting is Pope Francis says that politics, when in the pursuit of the common good, is one of the highest forms of love. Most Catholics actually agree more with Pope Benedict, though. Pope Benedict said that when politics attempt to be salvific, that attempt to take the totality of life and be messianic, they become demonic. Catholics in the United States and millennials in the United States have a lower view of politics, the political culture, than the public at large. So I think there's a lot of overlaps between how young people at large, who are highly secular, the nuns, if you will, and Catholics as a general population are seeing American politics.
Yeah, So how does faith then factor in among millennial voters?
Well, I wanted to. It's no wonder. It's no wonder they're so negative about politics, right? Because what they've been seeing. I love the name of the book that you're writing. We testify with our lives, right? I was like transfixed with the theme of the Pope's visit last year, which was "Love is our mission," and I thought. Thinking about millennials, of course they're nuns, right? Like, what are they seeing, of the church? We've bought into so many of our moral imperatives actually being political issues, and now the way the world is, because everything's so politicized, and the way the media covers things, and even the way we talk, people know what the church says no to. They read press releases, it's all in this political context. And so again, not trying to be Pollyannish, but this sort of glimmer of hope I see with millennials being a little disengaged, is that they can focus on some more fundamental things, right? And maybe where there's fear and there's despair, if they're starting to rebuild, then that's not a solution for November, mind you, but there's a rebuilding that can start to happen. Now, of course, that has to mean that they tap into things that are true and good and beautiful, and not reinventing wheels, but there may be something there for them. But in terms of, I had this really liberating moment last presidential cycle, in my despair, sort of. I was over in Rome. It was the year of faith, and I was at the opening mass, and Pope Benedict actually it was the 50th anniversary of the closing of the Second Vatican Council at the same time. And Pope Benedict had the idea, apparently it was his idea, or so I was told, like 3 weeks before he came up with this idea to take these messages that Paul VI gave at the closing of the council, to reissue them. And I didn't even really know these existed. Which is sort of the point why he thought this would be a good idea. So there were messages to artists and laborers and people and scientists, people in different walks of life, and there was a message to women. And for whatever reason, I got a phone call to receive this message from Pope Benedict, and it in part talks about. First of all, it's one of the greatest failures of communication in the history of the Catholic Church, because it's like this love letter to women, and how it talks about how we need women impregnated with the gospel to hold back man's hand, as civilization is in danger of falling. That the Catholic Church believes this about women is not something that we very well communicate. But at the same time, it turned out that the vice presidential debate was that night. So it was like 3:00 in the morning in Rome, and I was trying to organize like a debate watching party that didn't go over too well. But I was sitting in my hotel room watching CNN International, and we had to talk about you might think we'd have the most Catholic election then, right? You'd had 2 Catholic vice presidential candidates. It was really historic. And then I'm watching the debate, and I'm realizing, and they have 2 entirely different views of the world, and what does this mean for us? And there wasn't even like the common ground of being Catholic that they could meet on, it seemed. And I thought, we don't deserve better politics until we're better at it. And anyway, again, I sort of see this as all a wake-up call that we should have had a long time ago, in the frustration of these 2 candidates and everything that's going on around us. But it really is just sort of a symptom of everything else, the fear and the despair, and then people not being true to who they say they are.
And I wonder whether or not actually the issue of faith among millennials actually might give me some optimism, in part because what I see in my classroom is like students are really interested in sort of retrieving religion as a kind of resource. Their biggest concern is when it becomes overly doctrinal or overly dogmatic. And again, I'm not Catholic, so it may raise some concerns for other people, but I find that my students are really open to engaging sacred texts as long as they're able then to weigh, along with other scholarship, right, sort of the best uses for these texts. And once that happens, like there's this guy named Vincent Winbush who talks about the idea of the Bible among African Americans as this notion of a talking book. And this notion is that, well, the book is always, you're always engaging the book and it's always talking back. And you do so without necessarily, say, with a priest or with someone in an authority to help you sort of make sense of it. But my students often find that somewhat liberating, in part because the community then affirms what you think you're hearing the book say, argue or convey. And I find among Jews and Catholics and Protestants, people want some sense of the sacred in their lives, but they don't want this idea of one authority figure. But on the contrast or the challenge that point, I thought it was rather interesting when Pope Francis came last year. My students were all like enthralled. I mean, everyone was sort of like, maybe watch us in class, they're really excited about the visit. And to me, again, that speaks to this idea of a longing, the need for someone of a kind of sort of sacred nature, prophetic nature. The students are interested in engaging. The question becomes then, what do we do with the message? And whether or not does it become doctrinal? Is it simply a part of our morality? And are people willing then to have those kinds of distinctions that maybe I'm not religious, but I have moral beliefs that are influenced by certain religious traditions? And I do think that I'm finding millennials are very much interested in a deep moral life that has links back to religion.
As a millennial Catholic, I think when I see Pope Francis, when I look at him and see him on television and hear him speak, I don't see a quote-unquote religious leader. I see Jesus Christ. And I don't mean that in some super spiritual or aesthetic way, but like when you hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and who Jesus is and what Pope Francis does, that's the whole idea of the papacy, right? Papacy was supposed to be the vicar in the person of Jesus Christ. And I think what he's done for millennials that makes him very attractive is we're getting back the bread and butter basics of the gospel. I think we're kind of going on that question of like this Catholic and Christian failure in some ways to be effective in American life and American politics. I don't think the problem's out there. We spend too much time in the Catholic Church blaming the isms, secularism, consumerism, and the rest. And I think we spend too much time blaming the isms of the world and less time retrieving and practicing the core of faith. And I think Pope Francis said that I have a dogmatic certainty. My first dogmatic certainty is that God is in every person's life. When you lead with that, you're going to get young people back. I think our church in the United States, and from a very particular American perspective, we spend too much time, and I mean this as our pastors, the bishops, the priests, the pastors of our church, we spend too much time leading with a dogmatic faith, preaching ahistorical fundamentalism, having rhetoric that's high on privilege and low on wisdom, really. And I think we need to spend more time getting back to that core dogma. The first dogma of faith is that God is in every person's life. And this isn't some branded BS. I really think that before we get into the teachings of the church, we need to invite, and I think the Catholic Church really struggles with this, and we can learn from the evangelical tradition to reclaim this. We need to invite people to an encounter. We always say that young people are spiritual but not religious. I think the first goal of the church is to give people the Spirit, and so I think we need to reclaim that. I think, and unfortunately, I think in the United States, our church, the Catholic Church, has become too political in a lot of ways. We don't want our preachers, our priests, our bishops to be politicians. We want them to be pastors. And people will ingrain in themselves the truths of faith in the public sphere. But when we start having realms of condescension, when it seems that our bishops are obsessed with reproductive issues, obsessed in ways that limits the totality of faith, I think that we really lose young people. And I think we have to be really careful. I mean, a church without millennials is a church without a future. And there is no guarantee of faith moving forward. We don't have the guarantee. There's always this notion that, well, the young people, when they leave, they'll come back. We don't know that. We need to be a church that's, instead of being obsessed with keeping the saved, we need to be a church that is obsessed with finding the lost and coming outside of ourselves. And that takes courage, because it means we have to be less obsessed with the hierarchical church. We have to be more willing to make a mess, as Pope Francis says, to have an encounter that challenges us, and that where the rules of the road aren't always clear. And I think that would be a missionary church that would be effective, and a church, I think, that would make Jesus proud of who we are.
But I wonder, Chris, I mean, would millennials want to push back and say, well, we actually want a church that's really honest, and also a church that's sort of critical and aware of its history. Mm-hmm. And so to argue that religion and politics are distinct, right, I think would do a disservice to, say, the history of the church in terms of whether it's colonialism, whether it's, slavery in the U.S. And so I think people want to say, look, it's muddied. The water is muddied, right? And we do have a kind of sort of bizarre history. But let's engage that as we try to bring people back, as you say. And also, when you refer back to going back to our bread and butter, my fear is that people might say, wait a minute, I was never a part of your bread and butter. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's not the starting point. Maybe we need a new starting point to engage these millennials that you want to bring in. But when you bring them in, the question becomes, do you want them to help rethink the church, or do you want them basically to kind of fit into what is already pre-established?
And if I could just respond to that, yeah, I don't mean to keep, Catherine, I want her to be in it as well.
Oh, no.
I think
I'm loving listening.
Jesus, so from the Catholic Christian worldview, who is Jesus Christ? He is the recreator, right? Recreation. That's actually kind of a funny word if you think about it. Recreation, to play. He's the recreator of creation. God was a creator, it was fallen, and Jesus recreates. I guess my argument is, or my thought is, that we have to acknowledge, each generation has to acknowledge that we have a responsibility to recreate the faith. Georgetown has given a great example of this. When you recreate the faith, you have to acknowledge that you are sinners, that you have failed, and that you have used the name of God in failure, with Georgetown acknowledging that, yes, this university was built by slaves. Yes, that is a profound failure. And I think that young people, instead of trying to gloss over the history, we love two things. And I hate speaking for all millennials, because I think the millennials are as diverse as the nation and the world itself. But I think that two things that millennials really particularly like are authenticity and inclusivity. And how we go back to this question of bread and butter, I think from a Christian, so if we were doing a marketing campaign, the marketing campaign would say, let's go to the middle. Let's look at the middle and build out. Let's do a middle-class church, middle-class saints. But if we really believe that Jesus' message is true, our epistemology has to be from below. And so I think that there has to be a church that starts with the experiences of the most excluded people in society. And there you are, the most irreligious people in society. My first focus as a Christian should be on those who want nothing to do with Christianity. And I shouldn't simply, when I evangelize, it's not me just passing on something. I should have an encounter. They should teach me something. The church needs to learn more from the experiences of women. When we spend so much time, I think, creating a culture of condescension towards women, there's no way that that's going to be a relationship. So I think there has to be a humility that we take. But on how we start, whether Jesus is a starting point or whether relationships a starting point, I'm still learning about that. I don't know. But I think that we need to have a new mindset of starting from below and having the most inclusive population possible, if that makes sense.
I loved what you said, Chris. Chris, about seeing Pope Francis, seeing Jesus. Another way of putting that is you see Pope Francis and you see love, right? I mean, that's what people are reacting to. It's that there's something welcoming about him, and he doesn't give up any truth as he does that. One defense I'll launch on bishops, part of the reason they're often found talking about issues like abortion and religious liberty and things like that are, I think, an indictment of the laity. The church is not just the bishops, and we often think of it as so. And so then maybe women aren't speaking up as much as they should, or fathers aren't speaking up just because, well, whatever the priest says. Many priests and bishops that I know would rather talk about anything else, but some of the things they wind up having to talk about in a political context. A lot of them want people to meet Jesus Christ. That's why they became priests in the first place. And so I do think that if Catholics are better at and maybe the millennials, if they come in, they'll do it. Be better at remembering that they're part of the church too, and need to take the gospel as seriously as anyone. And Pope Francis is an example of this too. He only gets quoted on certain things, right? Frequently. But you saw an example during that Georgia Azerbaijan trip too, where he talked about the dangers of gender theory and at the same time on the press plane also answers practical questions about what do you do when you have someone who's changed their sex who's now in your parish, and what does the priest do? Well, you still look at him as Jesus would, and you still walk with him, and that's always his answer. It's not we're going to change doctrine and recreate the church in a millennial image or something. No, we're still going to tell the truth. But do you know that you're loved by God? Like, can we start there? And by being so inviting and welcoming, I think that's what he's trying to model. I think he's also trying to model too, and this goes to the authenticity thing. Sometimes we're not going to give the perfect answer, and sometimes there isn't a perfect answer, to some of these complicated, neuralgic questions, and so that's okay if you truly love the person, and one thing I was fascinated about you talking about ancient texts and how millennials want to engage. Pope Francis is a Jesuit, right? And Ignatius Loyola gave us this great gift of the spiritual exercises, which are all about reading the Bible as a living text and really trying to see what God is telling you through that and deep prayer. And if you listen to I often call Pope Francis the Jesuit spiritual director of the world, because if you read his morning homilies especially, but really any of his homilies, it's like he's directing us through the spiritual exercises, where he's saying, so often, I mean, he repeats himself all the time, and which is the most liberating thing in the world for people who write and talk. You realize, oh, I may be listening to what I'm saying, but you can repeat yourself because other people haven't heard it, perhaps. But he says, you say you're Christian, but you're lukewarm. Is it? Is the gospel really changing the way you live your life from day to day? And I think if he can not only attract but then tap people into this, young people into this, I mean, we could have a really different looking church, and not because any doctrines changed, because people are taking it more seriously in ways that I mean, the baby boomer generation, right, was the personally opposed generation. And this idea, I love what you said about the isms. I talk about secularism a lot, but it's our our internalization of it in many ways. I mean, we've privatized our Marianne Glendon, the former Vatican ambassador, puts it well, and Harvard professor. She says that Catholics a couple of decades ago decided to either be chameleons or turtles. You hide yourself in your shell and hope nobody notices that part of your life, or you just blend in with the culture. And I don't think millennials quite will put up with that. And so they want a church that is confident and loving, and you can be both of those things, I think.
But can you have a deeply inclusive church without changing the doctrine? I think that's the question I hear them raising. And even when I think about millennials' lives, say, outside the classroom, I mean, most of my students are kids who were put on a certain kind of trajectory. And it was a sense in which, it was a very middle class trajectory, right? You start off, you're in soccer practice, you learn how to play the piano, and you learn the system. And that's a very particular way to see the world. And my fear is that as we have added numbers, say, to the classroom, I mean, what we're seeing is that people that the system hasn't changed even as we've opened doors. And I think a prime example in the DC area is what's happening to Thomas Jefferson, right? And again, I know you probably wonder, what's the connection? Well, the connection is, people are very concerned that there's a South Asian population. Some people have written in the post saying, they've taken over, right? But in part, they basically play by the rules, right? They took the test, they got in, and those are the people who were getting in. And so I think that example reminds me of when we talk about, let's bring in all these people, let's have an inclusive, loving sort of context, well, then what happens when they all get there? And they're all very successful. And now we have to figure out, well, how do we sort of determine who gets in and who doesn't? That's when the fear and I think the prejudices emerge. And so, and part of my concern is that, taking the Thomas Jefferson example, we just look at people so narrowly. So my fear is that, and this is my concern with the black church, is this idea, when a transgendered person comes, it's like, okay, yeah, we want to love them and give them truth, but what then does the truth look like? Mm-hmm. Does it mean that, the transgender person is wrong? Does it mean that the church is wrong? I mean, is it possible to have both and still maintain your doctrine, but recognize that, this is a loving creature created by God? And I would argue that I don't think the idea of transgendered or even, what is it called, non-gender identifying, whatever. I mean, these kinds of concepts have been fluid throughout our world history. It's just that they've been sort of buried, right? But I think if you talk to people who are in the church, in the synagogue, in the mosques, they know that there are all kinds of, people. And they recognize that, people, quote unquote, transgress the doctrine, but they still allowed them they were still welcomed. And they were protected in those spaces. Now, one may argue that they were protected, but they're closeted, but nonetheless, people knew they were there. And so my fear is that whenever we say we have new challenges, I'm not sure if they're always new challenges. I think maybe they take on different sort of forms, but this idea of, sort of struggling with sexuality, right? I mean, come on, it's not new at all. We've just never really faced it in a very public way. And I think now we're being forced to deal with it. And it is difficult, right? I mean, it's a huge, as a father, I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I raise my son to, I don't know, should I let him wear dresses if he wants? I just, because it really is, it's a very different context now. And I think, again, the questions were there 100 years ago, but now we're in a context where people are like, I think bringing those questions to the public sphere. And I think as a parent, as a teacher, I'm challenged. But I don't know that our culture is providing the resources to help us sort of think through this in a rich way that allows us to take in competing points of view.
Well, building on what you've said, we've sort of established there's a really complicated relationship with religion when it comes to millennials. You've mentioned sort of the last 100 years, really thousands of years, where these issues have been there, but now they're just sort of keep on coming to the surface. What are some of the other issues that are dividing or potentially uniting millennials when it comes to race and class and, questions like sexual identity and other ideological challenges that we keep on seeing that seem to be coming to the surface and perhaps are alienating them from the church, or perhaps are just alienating them from the broader culture altogether?
I think the most noteworthy one that exists in Western culture in the United States is the question of LGBTQ issues, and that was really on the conscience of the American church for the past, I would say, 5 or 6 years. But now, with starting with Ferguson in the United States, I think people are actually really looking for Pope Francis to address racism. He really has never done so in a very profound context, with outside one visit where he connected anti-Semitism to racism in Rome. When he came to the United States, it's not something that he's really dealt with as well as we'd hope for. But I think on all these questions, I think we have to realize that, so the Catholic Church argues that we have a development of doctrine. Some people will argue that's just a BS argument for us to make ourselves feel better that the church doesn't change. Peter said in his letter to his community, "Slaves, behold your master." He was our first bishop of Rome. St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, was being innovative with prayer. He got thrown in jail by the Spanish Inquisition. The Jesuits who founded Georgetown were trying to be faithful to their God and to their traditions, and they used slaves to build their university. What's that to say? We don't always get it right. If you can argue the development doctrine is BS because it's really just it's pretending the church doesn't change. But what it does, I think, is it gives us a capacity to hold on to our traditions, to hold on to our gospel teachings, and realize that we change. That we change and we become more aware of what it means to be faithful to this gospel tradition. The reality of it is this: a church that excludes the LGBT community is a church without a future. There's just no way to imagine how we can exist as a faith community. Let's be honest here. 1 in 4 of priests in the United States are gay. The data says that. Even if you want to do the lowest percentages, 1 in 10. That means that all of us who are Catholic here have been developed, raised, and nurtured in the faith by a man who may be celibate, but who is LGBT. Gay Catholics and lesbian Catholics have, in my own life, helped me grow in the faith of Jesus Christ. We have to start acknowledging that the gospel mandate is not about excluding cultures and populations, but the absolute paradigm of the gospel is radical inclusion. Jesus is someone that I think read from any textual tradition is someone who's about reinstatement in the community. Now here's this question: what do we do when people are in the community? I don't think we have to know. I really think that the Christian tradition doesn't really have to necessarily give us answers, but give us a way of proceeding, if you will. So I think that we must do is what it takes to have this vision of radical inclusivity, even when it challenges the core of what we think is important in our faith tradition. And I think that's going to be very difficult on the questions of the LGBTQ issue. I think on the questions of racial inclusion, there are 2 churches in the United States, Catholic churches in the United States. You could argue maybe 3. There's really the white social bourgeois church of the classic parish. There is the Latino church. Latino churches often exist as an adjunct of the white parish. They have their Saturday at 5 p.m. Mass. And then there are black churches that exist separate in a lot of ways of the wider community. If we're going to be faithful, once again, to this universal tradition, I think we're going to have to tear down those walls. And that's going to create challenges because we are not just people of faith, but people of ethnicity and culture. When I go to Mass at Holy Trinity, 98% white, Jesuit parish, and I do in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I receive God and Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, that's about all that's similar from when I go to St. Augustine on Sunday. And that is a good thing. But we need to acknowledge that those are both authentic expressions of what it means to be Roman Catholic.
As you were talking, and I was thinking about the question, I think her name is Catherine Wire. I think she's a professor at Barnard, and she uses sort of rhetorical theory to kind of to look at the Church of Corinth, and she argues that part of the issue with Paul when he stumbles upon Corinth is that there's a huge debate happening. The women are prophesying, they're healing. There's a lot of uproar in the community. And she argues that one of the reasons why Paul says women should be silent is in part because they were so vocal. And she felt like Paul was torn in terms of, do we maintain the church? In terms of, do we basically reinstate a certain kind of structural order so that men are reinserted as sort of the head and women follow suit? Or do we allow for this sort of radical activity of women, right, who clearly are, in his eyes, according to the scholar, were operating in the Spirit. And in some respects, I wonder if that doesn't also sort of beckon us to consider what's happening now in terms of whether it's Black Lives Matters or whether it's sort of immigration reform. There's a sense in which, we have a public or a church where people are, in some ways, they're screaming, they feel as if they're operating in the Spirit, and they're trying to get people to hear their voices. And I wonder, are we going to say, let's silence them and then reinsert a certain order, or are we going to try to hear, right, what these women are saying? And what's interesting about these women is that even with Black Lives Matters or with immigration reform, we see a number of women, right, who are leading these causes, but yet we often ignore that in terms of as reporters or as writers. But I think there's something to be said about, why are these women at the forefront of issues that most of us see as sort of marginal? And also, I'm wondering, when women, for example, raise their voice, why do we always see it in opposition? So in other words, when the so-called other raises his or her voice, why do we always see it as oppositional? And do we ever have a moment in our public culture where we can actually, let's hear what the voice is saying before we actually go in and criticize it? And so I do think that sort of the race and gender piece are critical issues that my students are struggling with. And we can't forget about class, right? Because so much of this is this idea of people are concerned about their future, but also they're concerned about, will I have a space in these elite settings, right, that I've been prepared to enter? And that's a huge deal, right? I mean, parents have spent thousands of dollars to make sure that their children get to a certain kind of school. And the question, and then when they get to these places, they're often really afraid to sort of think outside of the box. They're great writers, they're great students, but they don't want to take a risk. They want to give me exactly what I want because they have to get the A so that they can please mommy and daddy. And my fear is that when that becomes sort of the dominant theme, then it limits, right, whether or not will you actually go march for, pro-life or go march for Black Lives Matter, because you're thinking, well, I have an assignment due, or I have to make sure that I receive a great recommendation, right? And I think people who often change the world are not concerned about that kind of success, right? And they know that it will come. And so, again, I'm looking for it, whether it's the church or outside organizations, to figure out, well, how can we create context in which young people can find possibly even competing ways, right, to have their voice heard, right, but also to sort of rethink what we take for granted.
When Pope Francis was here, he talked at the closing mass in his homily about how we can no longer have sterile divisions. And he said, may our children find in us models and incentives to communion, not division. May our children find in us men and women capable of joining others and bringing to full flower all the good seeds which the Father has sown. And I have the same reaction that I think you do to the word inclusivity, and because that is really a real question. And I think, what does truth mean, and how do we talk about these things? And I see partially an indictment again. Because there were really hard questions before transgendered issues were in the news, and we were sidestepping. A lot of us were sidestepping those just in our daily lives, but then on the whole panoply of issues, right? How much critical thinking do you have in Catholic communities in political conversation about poverty and immigration, and where are the Catholic leaders looking at Catholic social teaching and really trying to apply? And you have some, and but they're not they're not the leading voices, and thus you see situations as they are now. And the church, what's always striking to me about this is there's some hiccup, and John Carr could talk about this for he's the expert. I don't know where the point is where, so the church is on the ground in many communities, loving people, who never make the headlines, and that, again, in part, I think this is a little bit of an indictment of maybe the white middle class parish. If they don't have a relationship with these people, now they're giving money to the Cardinals Appeal or whatever it is, and so they're supporting the work, but that there's been a disengagement that can't, that encounter needs to happen at some point. And the church could help, and when I say the church, I mean all of us in the church, could be leading these conversations in more profound and clear and teaching ways. If that chasm that exists, where the love that is our credibility, on some of these issues, were better communicated. And I mean that's the case with so many of us have just put up our hands on the immigration issue, and we can't. These are human beings, and one way I think that maybe this gets to the millennial authenticity, wanting to see something good and speaks to some kind of truth or meaning. If they saw more of this, if they knew that story well, and if Catholics were more engaged, on a deeper and more clear level on some of these issues, because then they look and they don't see, oh, that's the church that opposes abortion and gay marriage, and no, they say those are the people who love, right? Cardinal Dolan had in his homily last year, the night before the March for Life. He talked about a Hispanic woman in Brooklyn, I believe, who was pregnant and she was scared and she didn't know what to do. But she knew that so she wound up having the baby and she didn't know what to do because she didn't have any support and so she brought the baby to church because she knew that there would be people there who would know how to love him. And that's what people need to see on every front. Like when you think of an issue, you think, well, the Catholics will help, and so often that's not what they see. And then I think we can get beyond too. Part of what just from my non-millennial observer point of view must be so shackling for millennials is to see how you have to pick a category, and so we wind up dividing ourselves into categories before we can even have a conversation about anything, which again is why I love this initiative so much, because I think it brings us out of our ideological silos. But so if people saw love from Catholics as their trait, and could see their identity not as whatever category we're in, but as loved children of a Creator, there may be a new opportunity. And I think Pope Francis in Laudato Si is just prophetic. In the model, the huge opportunity he's trying to give us, where everything is about stewardship and gratitude. We are created beings of a Creator, and thanks be to God, right? And so then you start looking at whether it's the environment or marriage or human life as a continuum, and things start making sense, I think it's a window in. It's not the answer to everything, but I think he's inviting us to just point people to gratitude and stewardship, and then maybe we can start having conversations around that, or just having communion, the communion point rather than sterile divisions, where you're actually listening to people and their experience and not just trying to give an answer,
Well, on that note, I'd like to listen to the audience's questions. If anybody has a question, we have microphones.
Good evening. Thanks for all of your thoughts. I actually have two questions, but if anybody wants to go after me, I'll happily hand this over. The first one is about your guys' conversation about inclusivity. So I don't know how to make this a question. I'll just make it a statement. I'm barely a millennial. I kind of that no man's land after Gen X, and from the limited interactions I've had with, I think, probably true millennials, I really do think that a lot of them have this idea of inclusivity as it really is this unfettered relativism, right? You can't tell me that I'm wrong. You can't tell me what is sin. Anything that exercises judgment is judgmental. And so I want to be included, but on my terms. Whereas you said the church is about radical inclusivity. Sure it is, but on Christ's terms, on the church's terms, right? So I've never been to mass where there's a bouncer at the front door. So if you're an LGBTQ person, you're welcome to be there. You've always been welcome to be there. But if you're practicing that lifestyle, then you and 100 other types of people who are living in objective states of sin, you can't participate sacramentally. Is that judgmental, or is that just the church exercise? Is that what millennials require for the church to give that kind of stuff up to be considered inclusive? That's really kind of the feeling I've gotten. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Can you comment on that?
Before we answer that question, I'd like to just see if there's another question from the audience. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talks. I was just hoping if you could comment on maybe the work of women religious, at least from just hearing some of the thoughts you've said. I think the church in some ways just has a PR problem. There's a lot of work being done on the ground and entering into that messy grayness of life, and we're somehow not getting the word out, or we're not highlighting the people who are absolutely engaged. So anyway, if you just had any stories or comments.
Okay.
On the question of inclusivity, Pope Benedict XVI, before he became the Pope, there's this he had Mass as a cardinal elector. They all came together after John Paul II's death. It was on April 16, 2005, and he said that the biggest threat facing the church today is what he called a dictatorship of relativism. I think it's actually a very profound idea. The idea that if you're right, if we live in a relative world where everything goes, it is a dictatorship in some way. I'm not anti-truth, and I don't think millennials are as well. I would say some millennials, we can talk about safe spaces and things like that at a different context, but I think we have to look on how we deliver the truth. The Gospel of Matthew, I think, is the best example, twice, and really in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke as well. I think, kind of imagine ourselves being an instrument of Jesus Christ. Jesus to heal people, there isn't a prerequisite. We have no evidence that the quote-unquote adulterous woman changed. We have no evidence. We have no evidence that people that Jesus encountered who were sinners changed or were affected by his message or by his work. And you have to remember, Jesus did not preach to them a message. He healed them. I think this is really important. The church, I'm quoting Pope Francis, the church is getting caught up in quote-unquote cholesterol issues. If you're on a battlefield and someone has a wound that is life-threatening, poverty, etc., you will focus on healing the human being, not whether or not they respond or not. The only way I think that young people are going to respond to the truth of the gospel, the truth of the faith, is by us acting in a way that shows them the love. The biggest educational tool of the Catholic Church is its people. You want to get the young people to read the Bible. The only Bible that many young people are going to read is an encounter with another Christian. So it's not putting truth to the side. It's saying the only way of entry is by loving them in the places where they feel most excluded. And I was also the women religious question. We do not value enough the work of women religious. Pope Francis at St. Patrick's Cathedral during evening prayer on the 24th September last year said, strong women, courageous women, the leaders of the faith. Right after Jesus Christ rose from the dead in Luke, Mary Magdalene was the one that Jesus encountered. And if you remember, Jesus said, go to my brothers in Galilee and tell them what happened. And so she's running. And I love that image of when Mary of Magdala, who history has put in an unfair, uncharitable light, Mary of Magdalene is the church. The very purpose of the church is to spread the gospel. She is running. This is not a meek and lowly woman. It's a strong woman. The church was birthed in the resurrection and spread because of a woman. And so I think that, once again, we need to, this is not some lefty BS. This is the cornerstone of faith that's shared from the gospel. If we rediscover that, if we rediscover women's particular role of spreading the gospel and communicating it, the church will be better for it.
Yeah, so I'm Protestant, so I have a very different kind of orientation. And, I just recall the story of Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was a dean at Boston University, considered a Christian mystic, and actually set out to create the country's first sort of interracial church out in San Francisco. And as a kid, he would read the Bible to his grandmother who had been a slave, and she says, "Look, read the Bible, but don't read Paul, because Paul says not so good things about women and slaves." And so, but she saw herself as a Christian. And so my sense is that millennials are not afraid of truth, and I don't think we can collapse our ideas in terms of relativism, but I think they want us to acknowledge that truth has always been contested, right? And what we define as truth often came out of, years and years of struggle and of back and forth of trying to figure out what did the scripture say about X or Y. And so I think that becomes the biggest issue that I encounter, is that people want a kind of a truthfulness about how do we come up with this truth? And so for my tradition, there's a sense in which, in spite of, right, what the social world said about African Americans, they still took into, we found other places that actually show that we are pretty darn incredible people. And so historically, we've always kind of, what might call cherry picked. Some might call, inserted a radical hermeneutic. There are all kinds of ways you can describe it. But what is overwhelming is that people, earlier, so the slaves did not allow the social world to determine their reality. Even when the social world tried to say, well, look, I'm treating it this way because of Scripture. They always found counterexamples. So to me, that becomes a kind of a radical way of looking at hermeneutics, this idea that there might be very multiple ways of seeing a text. And does that mean that one is relativistic or one isn't sort of the truth? I don't know. But I think millennials want us to kind of, acknowledge that truth, acknowledge that our truth has been contested historically.
Are there other questions?
Sorry.
I just want to say
Oh,
something
yeah, go ahead.
quick about the question of do they just want relativism? The fact that so many young people are into Pope Francis, I think is another huge opportunity for the church. When he did it was 1,000 interviews ago, but when he did his very first interview, it was a big deal. And when he was asked who is Jorge Bergoglio, he said a sinner. That is his identity. He's a sinner in need of a savior, right? And if the church can lead with that more, and almost even both being loving and confident, but also penitential about the fact that we haven't led with these things all the time, I think is important. There's this Jubilee year of mercy that's almost over, and I fear a lot of Catholics don't even know what was going on. But key to that is the idea of confession, right? And then there are these holy doors at churches, and I don't think people know what it means, but it's actually a very powerful campaign if if we articulated it better. And I think it's best represented by an image of Pope Francis. He's done this a couple of times now, but the first time he did it, it was like shocking. It was, I think it was it was Holy Thursday or Good Friday, and he's at St. Peter's Basilica, and on live TV, he goes to confession. You know, he was out of the earshot, but I mean, the idea the Pope is a sinner. You know, this is what it's about. I think that if that were communicated better, I mean, it's attractive. It answers a longing, you know. That there's something there that I think really could be quite powerful. And about women religious, they built our schools and our hospitals, and I think we're underappreciating the rebuilding work and renewing work that they're doing today, and not just some of the younger orders, but ones that have been around for a long time and have deep roots. And not just the women religious, the men too. You know, the Dominican House of Studies here in Washington is filled to capacity. It's all young people. It's really exciting to see so many communities that are thriving.
So yeah, I think that one of the major issues that I see within that kind of turns millennials away both from this election as well as from maybe to a certain extent, embracing their religion and talking about their religion is the volume of hate and negativity. And when we give it that volume, we give it power. So I guess what I was just wondering is, what are the ways in which we can overcome that? I think that you gave a very good one, which is embracing it in a penitential way, embracing the things that we've done wrong within the church. For example, I think that if someone says, why are you still Catholic? How can you still be Catholic in spite of the fact that the sex abuse scandal and any number of different things, the Crusades, you can go back, centuries. I think embracing that penitential part and that human part that we have, I think, is key. But what are the ways in which we can overcome kind of the volume of negativity and then the power of it? Because I think that that's pretty key to moving forward and getting the debate to be around something else. Anyway, I was just curious what you thought.
Archbishop Chaput gave a speech at Notre Dame a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the election. And we were talking about this earlier. I had actually forgotten about the most important part. I was rereading it today. And that was the part where he talked about silence and the need for praying about the election. He confessed he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do on election day, but he was going to pray about it. And I think that whatever Christians in the public square can do to draw people into a more prayerful reality about the country, and praying for praying for the candidates, praying for people in elected office, praying. I sometimes tell the story. It's so not flattering toward me, but of the morning after election day 8 years ago, a priest friend of mine called me on the phone and he said, so he knew I had been up late and covering the election and whatever, and he also knew I wasn't happy about the results, and he said, well, you're praying for the president-elect, right? I'm like, whoa, it's too soon, Father. Can't you give me a day? And he was absolutely right. I mean, I should have been praying for him a week before, and by name, and we don't do that. And this is part of the, the indictment and the penance that we have to be honest about. And Cardinal Dolan spoke to this a couple months ago, talking about meeting people in our wounds, sort of like be upfront about we're not perfect, because people have the impression that we've got our act together, and that's why we're religious people. No, it's because we don't, and we're trying to become more like Christ every day. And if they see that, then it's just a whole different conversation about politics, about human life, about everything, human lives. Just living. Anyway.
I would say that I think, I could say go out there and denounce hate, etc. My party, my movement spends a lot of time speaking to people's ideals, but not nearly enough time speaking to people's legitimate fears. We can denounce Trump supporters or surrogates as racist, xenophobes. We can denounce Hillary supporters as pro-abortion, etc. The realities on the ground are so much different. Even the words that have so much connotation, racism is complicated. It's not just simply a moral issue. It's a sociological issue. It's an economic issue. I think we need to spend a lot more time figuring out the complexities of the isms and be very careful on the hate. Be very careful not just to denounce the hate, but actually encounter the deep realities that are undergirding that, because I think we'd be surprised. Look, I think some of the smug lefties that I'm one of them and who I hang out with cannot imagine why someone would vote for Donald J. Trump for president of the United States. 44% of Americans are going to. I would not be a good Christian, I would not be a good American if I simply wrote off 44% of the United States as deplorables. We need to better understand why people have some of the deep-seated issues that they do and see the world that they do. And if we can denounce them as racist, bigots, etc., that's not going to change anything. I think we really have to encounter the people that we would spend our lives at the top of our lungs yelling against everything they stood for. If we spent just a few minutes understanding the deep reasons why they feel the way they do, that would do a lot more.
Terrence, final words on the hate?
Oh, no. Yeah, I think it's complicated, and I also think that, we still can't be afraid to use our prophetic voices. And I think it's one thing to dislike people because of how they vote. It's very different just to identify people as morally sort of, repugnant. And I do think that, or assuming that, women are simply for one purpose. So I do think that sexism and racism there's some deep lines there. And I think we can understand people, and at the same time, if we're going to remain truthful to the church or to the doctrine, we still hold them accountable when hate is hate. And I think that's part of the issue we're having now. Millennials are like, we want someone who's truthful, which is interesting. People dismiss Bernie Sanders, right? But there was something about his message that people galvanized around. And then one might argue the same thing about Trump. But I do think there are two different messages. And so, but the question becomes, how do we get people to hear each other? And I'm not sure, again, we have the cultural context for that. So.
Yeah. John?
Join me in thanking our panel. It's just terrific. Especially want to thank Terrence. It's sort of a Catholic conversation here.
Yeah.
You more than held your own. Very helpful insights. A couple things. We have food and drink upstairs, and we hope to spend some time continuing the conversation. Secondly, we have several other gatherings coming. One of them is October 12th, next Wednesday. And was mentioned by a couple people, the issue of slavery. It's very particular with Georgetown. This was not in the history books. This was in the life of this institution. So we're having a session at 7 p.m. On the main campus on slavery, Georgetown, and Catholic social teaching. On October 25th, we're having a session on working class people and communities that have been left behind, big part of this election. On November 10th, 2 days after the election, we're going to have a discussion of what it means and what it means in light of the principles that we think are important. We have E.J. Dion, Michael Gerson, Elizabeth Diaz, who is the religion reporter at Time, and Bob Costa at the Washington Post. And then two others. On December 5th, I think, Mark Shriver, some of you may know the name Shriver from history. Mark Shriver, son of a former vice presidential candidate, Kennedy in-law, wrote a wonderful book on his father, Sarge Shriver, who in some ways epitomized our values. He went in search of Pope Francis, and he went to Argentina, he went to Rome, and he has come back to share his search, and he'll be with us December 5th. And on the 29th of November, is that right? We're going to have another Salt and Light gathering, but it's not going to be here. It's going to be on Capitol Hill, and we hope you will join us for that. And that's how I'd like to end. A conversation as rich as this needs to be shared more broadly, even when there's lots of traffic and lots of competing events. Please invite others. Give us names of people that can be a part of this, because the more people that can experience what we had tonight, the better. So thank Angela, our panel. I want to thank Kevin, who helped Angela pull this together. But I especially want to thank you for coming out. Thanks very much, and we'll see you upstairs.